When broadcast television finally became available for the people of continent of Vespucci, the first legends about hidden channels became stories that were shared in bars, schools, and even amongst each other. Sometimes these stories die out in oral tales and rumors that die out throughout the years. However, sometimes the legends survive long enough for me to write them down. One such legend was shared between the residents of both the Kingdom of Vespucci and also the Empire of the Seven Cities is the legend of the floating head. An odd legend, certainly, except interestingly the first tales occurred during the Great War, and the latest tales endured well until 10 years after the start of the Imperial Vespucci War. So most of these legends cannot be spread among both nations by word of mouth, simply due to the fact that travel between the nations is highly restricted, and television signals from both countries were barred. Still though, legends of the floating head endure, with the most recent recorded account being 15 years ago. Exact stories about whether or not the head is benevolent, malevolent, or ambivalent vary by the storytellers, and there is a very real possibility there are other stories that are simply never brought to light. If there is a pattern, it is beyond me and beyond what my allies understand about what kind of being this floating head can be. We do, however, have a few theories. Some theorize that the floating head is a type of fae that has adapted to the technology of the era to allow itself to draw in new prey and entertainment. Others believe the head is a Vespuccian variant of the Kazu, one that behaves almost nothing like a Kazu. Then there are those who say it is a spirit that haunts hidden television channels, also adapting to a new means to let itself into modern homes. Then there's my theory. I believe that the floating head is a brand new type of being, one that exists primarily in the static and the signals, something that either existed long before we had the technology to send the signals, or something that came into being because of these signals. And now, just as we watch the floating head beyond our screens, we try to learn about this beast from the abyss, so too does this beast gaze into us and learn about us. The earliest story, an oral tale from Westbrook. It started as a flicker on the screen. I couldn't go to sleep, so I was watching the television screen while my wife went to bed. My insomnia was bad in those days, and all I could do was watch the television as the end of the broadcast began to play. The last few shows of the day were reruns of variety shows shown earlier in the day, and then there was the national anthem that played as the end of the broadcast day was announced. We didn't have the modern 24-hour broadcasting that is the standard now. Television played from 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. with 6 hours of static playing between. So when the static played, I stared at the screen in a state of not quite awake and not quite asleep. It was there in that space between insomnia and sleep, I saw the head in the static. Just ahead, where the neck should have been, there was more static. The head was little more than a shape as I could see the mouth opening and closing. A flicker and the head was there, and flicker and then it was gone. Each time it came back, the head was a little clearer. There were droopy eyes, long hair behind the head that descends past the missing neck. The mouth had teeth inside, and inside of the static, I could hear a voice that was gradually growing stronger inside of the static. I was too tired to think clearly. I must have thought it was just part of a show, or maybe a half-formed dream in the half-sleep state. I learned later in life that hypnagogia is the term for that state between wakefulness and sleepiness when you're falling asleep. It's common to hallucinate during that state, and for a long time, that's what I thought this was. I heard the voice echo through the television, a voice that rang clear through the static. "Sleep," the voice said, just before I fell into darkness. That was not the last time I ever heard that voice. Even years later, even though I've never seen that face again, never saw that head again, I still hear the voice. Every night at exactly midnight, I hear that voice telling me to sleep, and I sleep for at least 6 hours. I cannot be awoken at all between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. Even if I am hurt while I sleep, I cannot wake up. I have slept through literal tornadoes and firestorms. Even when my house burned down around me, I still slept and my wife had to drag me out of the house. Still, I fall asleep at midnight, like a clock. I have seen every doctor I can afford. I have tried priests, psychics, hunters, and even sleep scientists from the MSU. They cannot find the source of why I sleep and why I stay asleep. For the most part, I've adjusted, and my family knows that at midnight until 6 a.m., I cannot be woken up. Except now, my kids are gone. My wife is dead. She passed away in her sleep next to me. I slept through her death, even as her corpse went rigid and cold, waking up to her cold body next to me. I am an old man now. I have no family, no one to notice if I do or don't wake up. I'm not scared of death. I am scared that I'll be told to fall asleep, and I will. And if I die in my sleep, that same voice will tell me to wake, and I'll rise from death, just like how I fell from life. A family story from Central Hill. Alyssa was always a good girl. She always listened to her parents. She always listened to her teachers. She always listened to the adults. She was well loved by the adults and despised by the children for reasons that Alyssa didn't understand, but everyone else understood. She was always a good girl. She always wore long dresses with leggings. Her sleeves were down to her wrists, and her neck was always covered in a scarf. A gift from her parents. Even on summer days, Alyssa always had long sleeves because she was always a good girl. On her 8th birthday, no children showed up to her birthday, but her teacher, who also happened to be her uncle, gave her a very special gift, a television set, just for her. Even though Alyssa had no friends over, she had plenty of cake, she had plenty of candy, and she had plenty of company from her parents and her uncle. After her party at the local pizza parlor, her television was set up in her room, and her parents agreed to let her stay up late, watching cartoons on her television. If only they refused. That night, Alyssa's parents heard her talking to someone in her room. They thought at first that she was only speaking to the figures on the shows. Like one of the shows where the character asks you a question and pauses for a response, except they only heard television static. So they figured it was just a quirk of the little girl as they went to bed that night, never to wake again. That night, around midnight, Alyssa tiptoed out of her room and went to the kitchen. She picked up the largest knife in the kitchen and she headed to her parents' room. While they slept an unnatural sleep, she sawed off her parents' head, starting with her father, where it took her nearly an hour to cut through the flesh, sinew, bones, and blood of her father. And with the head removed, she moved on to her mother, which took a lot less time with Alyssa's practiced cuts. Her mother and father's heads were removed, and she took them somewhere else. Some say she dropped the heads into a well. Others say that she left it in a pig pen for the pigs to eat it all. Others still say that she took the heads back to her flickering television and slid the heads into the static, where the heads are still screaming to this day. After her parents were dead, Alyssa called the police to report her crime, just like her parents always taught her to do when she found a crime. And Alyssa is always a good girl. The police arrived in minutes and found her white nightshirt covered in blood, her body covered in bruises, blood on her hands, and still clutching the bloody knife. The parents were able to arrest her, and when they took her back to the police station, they did an examination, and they found evidence of abuse going back for days, if not weeks. Bruises along her thighs, stomach, chest, and neck indicated that she was abused for a very long time, and even as recently as that very night. It was believed that she attacked her parents in revenge for her abuse. When she was questioned, she would only say that the head in the TV told her to fight back. When questioned further, she would tell them about a floating head behind the static with a clear voice. A head that told her that her parents were never going to stop hurting her, that they were always going to hurt her, and no matter how good girl she was, they would hurt her, and the only way to make them stop was to be a bad girl. So Alyssa decided that meant grabbing the knife and cutting their heads off. As she cut their necks, the voice sang lullabies through the radio in their room. A radio that the police weren't able to find. And after she cut the heads off, she gave them to the head in the TV, who then told her she didn't need to be a bad girl anymore to keep herself safe. It took nearly a year of psychological counseling before the courts decided Alyssa was sane enough to be raised by a family member. By that time, Alyssa never had a single issue. She always listened to the doctors, she always listened to the orderlies, and she always did as she was told. Alyssa was a very good girl, so her uncle raised her, and all seemed well. She no longer needed to wear long sleeves, and she could smile, and she even made a friend in school, another young girl named Sharon. One day, though, when sharing secrets, Sharon admitted that her own sister hurt her when she drank. She didn't want to tell the adults because she didn't want her sister to get kicked out again. Sharon's sister had already gotten in trouble with the police a few different times, and the last time Sharon's sister was kicked out, it ended with pregnancy, and the parents did not want to risk causing harm to the baby. So Alyssa told her how to find a friend in the television static. That night, Sharon spoke to the static while her sister drank in the other room, even when pregnant. That night, as she spoke to the static, she heard screams in the other room, and from inside of the television, she heard Alyssa's voice, soothing Sharon and telling her to stay in the room until the screaming stopped. When the screaming finally stopped and the television turned off, Sharon went into the kitchen where she saw the horrific sight. She saw her parents decapitated and holding each other in the corner, apparently terrified of whatever they saw in their last moments as they tried to protect each other from whatever they saw. Their blood coated their bodies, and even then, it was still leaking from their severed necks. And sitting in a seat was her sister's body, or what was left of it. Her sister's head was also missing, blood still leaking down her chest, her stomach cut open and empty. In her arms, swaddled in a blanket, was her sleeping infant, still coated in blood and amniotic fluid, nursing from the dead woman's breast. suckling equal parts milk and blood while the baby slept peacefully. In the middle of the kitchen was Alyssa, holding her knife and covered in blood as she smiled at Sharon. Now they won't hurt you anymore, and you don't have to be a bad girl, Alyssa told Sharon. Even though Sharon called the police on her bloody best friend, Alyssa didn't seem to care. She just listened to the static on the television as she listened to someone speak what only she could hear. That time, Alyssa was going to be in jail for a long time. Except that night, she just vanished from her cell. The only clues: the officer who was guarding the cell was asleep, unable to be woken up until dawn's first light, a radio that was playing static tuned to a frequency that had no station, and the knife Alyssa used to cut off her victims' heads was missing from the evidence locker. It is said that Alyssa still stalks the streets of Central Hill, and she is a very good girl, except to those who harm little girls. Then she will become a very bad girl to keep other good girls safe. Even though Central Hill has been occupied for over a decade now, even occupying soldiers will report seeing a little girl stalking the streets with a bloody knife, a wide smile, and white noise everywhere she walks.